Carney's definition of capital spending includes government handouts, corporate welfare, no doubt to benefit Liberal insiders. This elastic definition of capital spending allows Carney to balance the operating budget, not by balancing anything, but by shifting spending to the capital budget. Carney has no real plan to reduce spending, no real plan to balance the budget. Carney's real plan is to rack up more debt than Justin Trudeau while making it more difficult to track government spending. Not surprisingly, this important detail was completely left out of the speech from the throne. Let's call this for what it is. It's called budget trickery. It's called cooking the books.
That was Conservative MP Michael Cooper, and he's not exaggerating. According to a series of independent reports, Mark Carney's Liberal government is hiding tens of billions in spending, rewriting how budgets work, and claiming they'll balance the books with cuts that experts say are both implausible and undefined. The Parliamentary Budget Officer can't verify their numbers. The Howe Institute says the deficit will exceed $90 billion this year, and even the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives says the cuts would be the worst in modern history. Meanwhile, the federal government just hit a record high 445,000 employees, and that's despite promising cuts. This video will break it down, what Carney's plan really does, how they're hiding the numbers, and what it'll cost you if Canadians fall for it. Also, make sure you stay tuned for another quote of the day, which I'm sure you'll find very relevant given how things are going. My name's Isaac Lamoureux, and let's hop right into the report today. Mark Carney's Liberals have created a budget with two components. Firstly, an operating budget that includes salaries and department spending. Next, a capital budget for long-term or infrastructure investments. But they've stretched that second definition far beyond its normal meaning. And Cooper broke it down for us in his video. He explained that the operating budget would cover day-to-day government spending, while the capital budget would cover so-called investment. However, the problem with the capital budget, according to Cooper, is that it is not limited to capital spending like infrastructure. It also covers incentives that support forming private sector capital, or things that raise private sector productivity. Cooper said, quote, "In other words, Carney's definition of capital spending includes government handouts, corporate welfare, no doubt to benefit Liberal insiders." And something that happened, funny enough, just after Cooper's video was Carney disclosing his 103 potential conflicts of interest. I wonder how many of these would benefit from spending shifted to the capital portion of the budget. And to make matters worse, we don't even have a full federal budget to analyze. The Liberals announced they won't be tabling a formal budget at all this year, just a vague fall fiscal update. That means no full breakdown of spending, no line-by-line accounting, just the talking points they want you to hear, and none of the numbers they don't. Conservative leader Poilievre has been putting Carney on blast over the last few days, revealing the countless lies he told during the election about his investments. Poilievre noted several times during the campaign that Carney claimed he had no connection to Brookfield Asset Management, had no conflicts of interest, and had no investments. He claimed he owned nothing but cash and real estate, and bristled at questions from reporters about potential conflicts.
The rules say that those assets should be publicly disclosed within 120 days, which means you'll campaign in a coming federal election, most likely within the next 120 days, and are serving as Prime Minister now, with Canadians not being aware of what potential conflicts of interest you sought to avoid.
What possible conflict would you have, Stephanie? Stephanie, I'm complying with the rules. I'm complying with the rules in advance. Point final.
Are you saying you are not open to any conflict of interest?
Yes.
Someone spent most of his life in the private sector. There's no possible conflict of interest in your assets. That's very difficult to believe.
Look inside yourself, Rosemary. I mean, you start from a prior of conflict and ill will. I have served in the private sector. I have stood up for Canada. I have left my roles in the private sector at a time of crisis for our country. I'm complying with all the rules. Your line of questioning is trying to invent new rules. I'm complying with the rules that Parliament has laid out and the responsibilities of the Ethics Commissioner. and I will continue to comply with those rules.
He also said he was following the Conflict of Interest Act, but refused to proactively disclose any assets at the time. Poilievre said, quote, he knowingly owned 574 stocks and deferred profits and stock options in Brookfield and other companies. So it was patently, and now provably false, for him to say he owns nothing but cash and real estate. Despite claiming to have cut ties with Brookfield after launching his leadership campaign, Carney's disclosure confirms he continued to hold stock options and deferred share units in the firm, assets that are not easily sold or divested. The Parliamentary Budget Officer says the Liberals haven't even defined what counts as capital versus operating spending, but are still making projections based on that distinction. And according to the Howe Institute, the Carney government's deficit could reach $92 billion this fiscal year, double the PBO's projection, despite a separate $486 billion spending plan tabled without a formal budget. The cumulative deficit, apparently, could approach $350 billion, increasing Canada's net debt to GDP ratio to 44%. In his video, Cooper claimed that Carney's real plan was to rack up more debt than Justin Trudeau, and this is no small claim. I'll remind you guys that during Trudeau's tenure, he doubled the debt. That's right. When Trudeau took office in November 2015, the federal debt was $616 billion. On August 30th, 2024, the debt reached $1.232 trillion. As of right now, it stands at $1.266 trillion and is climbing by almost $110 million per day. During that same time frame, food insecurity increased by 111%, housing costs increased by 63%, and you all know just how much crime has increased, also largely due to repeat offenders being let free on bail time and again. During that time frame, though, crime increased by around 20% and violent crimes by about 32%. And remember, this is just reported crimes. Despite his promises to make cuts, Carney is also making promises to spend. In fact, back at the start of July, Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne ordered Liberal cabinet ministers to reduce program spending by 7.5% in fiscal year 2026, 10% in 2027, and 15% in 2028. More savings will be required to fulfill Carney's pledge to boost defense spending up to $150 billion a year to meet NATO's recently increased goal of 5% of Canada's GDP on defense spending. I'll remind you that the Liberals never even hit the 2% goal, let alone hitting this new one. Federal unions have also been freaking out about the proposed cuts. For example, President of the Public Service Alliance of Canada, Sharon De Sousa, said, quote, I'm very concerned by this announcement. The Prime Minister promised caps and not cuts, and it definitely feels like the public service workers are going to be bearing the brunt of this. According to a new study from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, the Carney government will need to cut 24% of public service spending for the Liberals to regain the billions it pledged to recover. Despite the Liberal government's ongoing promises of internal savings, job cuts, and fiscal restraint, Canada's federal bureaucracy recently swelled to a record 445,000 employees in 2024-25. That's right, a report released Tuesday by the Parliamentary Budget Officer highlights that the 2025-26 departmental plans found that the number of federal employees rose by over 13,000 compared to the previous year's plans, with the Canada Revenue Agency accounting for 1/3 of the increase. However, the report does predict that full-time federal employees are set to decrease from 2025-26 onwards, falling to 415,000 by 2027-2028. The report said, quote, that said, this projected decline, even if it materializes, still leaves the number of FTEs well above both the pre-pandemic peak, 382,000 in 2019-20, and the higher levels recorded during the pandemic, 413,000 in 2021-22. Even if the bureaucracy shrinks, Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, Franco Terrazzano, revealed that Canadians will likely be paying more for it. He said, quote, you're not just paying for a bigger bureaucracy, you're paying for a bigger bureaucracy taking bigger paychecks. Terrazzano added that since 2015, the federal government has rubber-stamped over $1.5 billion in taxpayer-funded bonuses, also dishing out over 1 million pay raises over the last 4 years. Terrazzano also pointed to rapidly rising costs associated with the growing bureaucracy, citing a 73% increase in the federal payroll since 2016. He said, quote, now ask yourself a question. Are you getting anywhere close to 73% better services from the federal bureaucracy? I think that answer is a big, fat no. So ask yourself, does this look like a government planning to cut anything? And it's not just happening here at home. Under Carney's leadership, The Liberals recently pledged $6.5 million in taxpayer funds to Moldova for climate resilience and gender equality initiatives, and that's without any mention in a federal budget line. This is the perfect example of how the Liberals are using the capital side of the ledger to quietly fund global pet projects off book and off radar. Let's return to the PBO. They wrote that, quote, "It is currently unclear what would be defined as operating or non-operating capital spending. The government could fulfill its operating budget goals, and yet, at the same time, the federal debt to GDP ratio could grow." And perhaps even more damning, quote, "The government could achieve its fiscal objective and yet be fiscally unsustainable." In other words, they can claim victory while everything gets worse. And we've seen this before with this Liberal government, with finance ministers celebrating GDP increase, primarily driven by ludicrous immigration, while GDP per capita, of course, has plummeted. But honestly, I think Michael Cooper said it best, reminding you again of what he said, which was, quote, "Let's call this for what it is. It's called budget trickery. It's called cooking the books." And he's right. Carney's not fixing the deficit. He's hiding it. He's not cutting waste, he's growing the bureaucracy. And he's not being honest, because the truth would have lost him the election. We've seen how he's done the exact opposite of what he claimed to do in almost every instance with US President Donald Trump. Before we wrap up though, here's the quote of the day segment, which you guys seemed to like last time. I found this one pretty fitting considering our government's current spending habits and ideology. My name's Isaac Lamoureux. Thank you for watching and God bless you.
I think they've made the biggest financial mess that any government's ever made in this country for a very long time. And socialist governments traditionally do make a financial mess. They always run out of other people's money.